cool.
Yeah!
Totally toothless, dude.
Wicked! Hell, delicious! Mega.
I have always liked Kawabunga.
Huh?
What goes, everybody, and welcome finally to the first episode of CineMillenials. I'm your host, Jonathan Walker, and for those of you who do not know, this is a podcast in which I, and hopefully in the future, a guest will discuss incoherently for about an hour about film. Great movies, mediocre movies, ones we love, ones we loathe, and everything in between. It's just a podcast for everybody who's basically a cinephile and just loves to talk about film in general. So, to kick off my first episode of the podcast, I chose a movie that I have nothing but complete and utter nostalgia for, which is the 1990 movie Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I will admit, it's a bit of a weird one to start off this whole series as, but I wanted to pick a movie that I honestly have a soft spot for, despite some of its faults, and simply because A, it's a very fun movie that's got a lot more layers than many people talk about, and B, because of the brand new game that came out, Shredder's Revenge, which is an old school throwback to the beat 'em up Turtles in Time that was in the arcade way back when, and it kind of shows how much we actually still love these characters despite how they're basically a product of the late 80s, early 90s. So I love these characters mainly because I have three brothers, and having three brothers, there's four of us, and there's four turtles, and we grew up watching the early 2000s, I believe it was 2003 series, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which I remember watching with them every, Saturday morning it was CW Kids. I forget the channel. I want to say it was like 13 or 15, something like that. But we would get up early Saturday mornings and watch the TV show, and then the later series fast forward in which they're in the future. And I think it was because of that our parents had got us the first movie and the third movie, one which I'd rather not discuss because it's generally not that good unless you guys want to hear about it in the future. But the first movie was a movie that I and my brothers watched a pretty decent amount and found joy in and laughed at, and was one that when I got HBO Max, found out it was on, and it had been years since I had seen it. So, an act of just pure curiosity, I watched it. And I was thoroughly surprised at a lot of the layers that are in the movie, dealing with brothers, the more dramatic elements within the movie, and the biggest one being the theme about family, which is a lot more deeper than a lot of family movies are today, but I think it's one that is worth discussing as a whole. That's why I picked this movie. And before we get to the movie, I want to talk about the history behind the characters themselves, because I think one of the biggest things we have to discuss before we talk about the movie is how this movie came to be and the history behind the characters. And then later, towards the end of the podcast, I think I'll go ahead and we'll talk about why these characters still seem to remain relevant today, especially considering we're still getting TV shows and two brand new games, one basically being ports of older games and one a brand new one, and then the potential talks of a brand new movie, which weirdly enough is being produced by Seth Rogen, which is kind of an interesting choice, but we got to talk about the history. So the characters came to be by Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman in their own basement, essentially, and made the company Mirage Comics. Basically an ode to the comics at the time and their love of Jack Kirby. And these were characters that were made in a time, I believe it was the mid-'80s, like probably around 85, if not a little bit earlier than that, where comics were becoming a lot more darker and themed. So we had characters like Daredevil, and we dealt with New Mutants. We also had The Dark Knight Returns, and a lot more heavy-hitting comics at the time. You also had the pseudo comic book movies, which weren't really based upon comics at all, like Terminator and RoboCop, and then also you had Alien, which granted it was in the late 70s, and then Predator, and I believe it was 86, 88. So we had the coming of characters that would later become comic book characters. Also, you had G.I. Joe and He-Man and Transformers, all in which would later get their own comic book spins. So it's really interesting because this opens up a time in the decade in which we start seeing these characters that story outside of a comic book sort of world, and then later introduce themselves, becoming this big, long, fleshed out universe in comic book form, and would spawn various different sort of stories and crossovers. So when they released their comic, it took off. It sold out, and it became this franchise that was very popular. And of course, when popularity strikes in a comic or anything else, you're going to want some form of merchandising. The IP was then taken to Playmates, and then it was brought up in toys. And when the toys came out, they needed a cartoon to go with it. Like He-Man and Transformers were the same way. They started out as toys and became cartoons. So thus, a cartoon was spun off in the late 80s. And because of the success of the cartoon, one of the people that was head of the merchandising of it said, well, let's do a movie. And not just a movie, a live-action movie. And what's funny about that is it was going to be a folly. A lot of people didn't think it was going to work. But this guy who was head of the merchandising, which I can't remember his name. There's a great documentary on Netflix. If you watch the Toys That Made Us series, they go over a little bit of the making of the movie. I can't remember the guy's name that did the merchandising, but he basically pushed to do it. He's like, no, this is going to work. Trust me. And they did it, and they got Golden Harvest to produce it, which, if I remember right, they did a bunch of martial art movies as well, which fits perfectly, especially considering you're doing a movie based upon Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, so you kind of have to have somebody, or at least the production company, who has had their feet wet in martial arts. So that's basically the general synopsis of how this movie came to be. And now that we've kind of gotten that thrown away, both the history of how the movie came to be and my personal connection to the movie, let's go ahead and dive into what I generally like. And I think the first place I kind of honestly want to start is, granted we'll get to the turtles themselves, is the take that the movie is based in, which is much more grounded in drama. The first time you notice this is just within the beginning of the movie. It starts out, we've got B-roll of the city, and April is talking on the news station about the uptick in crime, about a bunch of thefts being reported, and then we've also got a bunch of hoodlum children running around or being missing, or just like straight up disappearing somewhere, parents not seeing them. So I think this is kind of where I think the complexity of this movie, at least not so much a complexity as it is just the simple fact, it's a lot more grounded, this movie, is within that tone. I think setting the movie with this tone really kind of well rounds this movie to be more than just your children's movie. It'd be very easy for them to go about starting off with like an action scene and there being, say, like a bank robber or two, and then the turtles come busting in. You've got the title card and you've got the John Dupree music, which, by the way, John Dupree's composition in this movie is great, and I love the theme, and I also love some of the nods to like this Japanese feudal, at least feudal Japanese sort of feel. But anyway, it would be very easy for this movie to start out with a goofy tone from the get-go, and I think that's what separates this movie from just your standard child film to a more well-rounded family film. I think that's something I miss from a much earlier time, around like the late 80s, early 90s, because you had these family-centered movies that had a more darker sense, and it almost had stakes or grit to it that kind of reeled you in and kind of was a little bit more mature. Like, you could watch it when you were younger, appreciate the fun it has, and then as you get older, notice the much more darker, mature themes to it, or the humor that's in it. I think that's what separates a good family film to a great film in general. More ways to kind of notice this is throughout the movie. There's so many different threads, because if you were to take the turtles out, you basically have this story about April O'Neil, this investigator who's trying to basically, I don't want to say make a name of herself because she's basically on TV, but she kind of lives this typical rugged life as a down-on-her-luck reporter, trying to just put out a good story and make her boss happy, and while also irritating the sheriff, which you actually see in a scene. She is sitting in the office of the police chief, and you could tell that there's a history to them. Like, they've been down this road before, and he doesn't want to irritate her, but he is kind of tired of her crap, essentially. And they always have this butting of heads. And then not only do you have that, you've got the story of April's boss, who has to deal with the troubles he has with his son, who's just always taking off, not being home, not showing up to school. Where has he been? What's wrong with his kid? And am I a bad father? What's the deal here? And then, of course, you have Casey Jones, which, I mean, he's one of those characters. There's not much of a story to him, but he demands the screen whenever he's on set. So basically, you have these two very dramatic stories that you would find in most other movies in this movie about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I think that's what rounds this movie a lot more. Speaking of this more dramatic tone, I think what the main theme of this movie basically is about family. Like, that is the meat and potatoes of this movie. Granted, yeah, we're dealing with like human-sized turtles who wear bandanas, who learn martial arts from this man-sized old rat who learned martial arts from his master. It sounds bonkers and ridiculous, but because it's grounded in such a way where, yeah, it's a little campy, the fact we're watching these like turtles who can talk and know martial arts. There's a very sensible and relatable quality to this movie that you would think would be completely corny and cheesy, which it is corny and cheesy and sometimes, don't get me wrong. It's just we learn to also care about these characters so much, and it is put inside an environment where it makes sense. The first time we kind of see this is when the turtles get back, Abel gets mugged, and the lights go out, which is a great scene, a great introduction, actually. Abel gets mugged, lights go out, turtles beat up the thugs while also bantering in the dark. As they escape, they come back home to Splinter, and they kind of start basically glorifying the work that they did, only to revert back to like, no, we did great, Master. And you have Splinter's speech about how you can't be seen, because if you're seen, then it's just he's protecting his kids, which brings us to when he talks to his sons about how they have to learn this stuff. The wisdom I'm teaching you is crucial to your survival, because who's to say somebody won't kidnap you, test you, kill you? Who knows? Take these words, because there's gonna be a time I will not be here.
Your teenage minds are broad, eager, but you must never stop practicing the art of ninja, the art of invisibility. You are still young, but one day I will be gone. Use my teachings wisely.
A great lesson in which we have to, we as kids, we don't think about it. We want to have fun all the time. We don't want to have to listen to what our parents have to say or the wisdom that we have, the time that we have. We just want to have fun. Only to find out that someday we're going to be on our own, and we're going to miss the days that we're with our parents sometimes. Some people, granted, yeah, they've got a rough childhood, but there's people in our lives where we look back at and we miss them. Granted, whether that being we've moved away from them or they have long passed on, we will miss them. And we take the words that they say to heart. A great example for me was, how long was it? I think 3 years back or so, one of my grandparents passed away. And I'd worked a lot. I worked in my hometown at a grocery store. And whenever I had time off, I basically would just want to relax at home. I could have spent time with my grandparents if I wanted to, but I didn't, because I used the excuse that I didn't have time. And so there was a moment when she passed away that I was thinking, I totally didn't think about it. I was like, oh, I've got that Mr. Rogers documentary, because I've got Won't You Be My Neighbor, which is a great documentary, but that's a different topic. I wanted to lend it. I've been meaning to lend it to her because she wanted to see it. She loved Fred Rogers, and she's very spiritual, and so is Mr. Rogers, and I knew she'd wanted to see it. I was thinking, I ought to lend that to her. And then it dawned on me, I can't, because she's not there. And I broke down crying and just in frustration at myself, because I had squandered so many opportunities to spend time with her and my grandpa, that I could have just simply gone there. And they were just loving, and they had a lot of stories to tell, and just very like they really shaped my childhood. My granny, who passed away, that I'm referring to, was somebody I spent a lot of time with when I grew up. I remember going across the street, and I would see her after school was out, and we would spend time while my parents were working. We would watch TV. There would be days where my brothers and I would walk with her to the library, check out books, and we would read. She was an avid reader. And we would sit on the porch, and she would teach us great life lessons. It just, when I got older, I used the excuse that I just didn't have time. And that's a bogus excuse. because it's not that I didn't have time. I didn't make the time. And I think this film speaks to that. And it's not one that many people think about. The idea of cherishing your family. And I think that, which we'll get back to at some point, is why these characters work well. On the topic of family, we also have the Foot Clan, which, by the way, like, if you've ever seen that warehouse scene in which all the kids go and you've got all this 90s music blaring and you've got a bunch of skateboarding and kids are playing cards in arcade machines, like, as a kid, who wouldn't go there? Let's be honest. Like, that is one of the coolest places to go. But anyway, Shredder's entrance when he comes in also speaks to this idea of family, or at least broken family, in which he tries to sell these kids that is a place where they can go and be a family. Like, kids can flock to because they don't like their life. They don't like their parents. They hate where they live. So they sneak off to this underground warehouse and hang out with a bunch of other kids because they have this sort of, granted, it's a twisted sort of look that this is their family. Granted, it's not. It's a recruitment facility for this, guy from feudal Japan who wants to build an army of ninjas called the Foot. Like, it sounds campy as all can be, but this too is a great place where they drive home the theme of family or broken family.
You are here because the outside world rejects you. This is your family. I am your father. I want you all to become full members of the Foot.
Danny is a character in which, like we discussed earlier, his dad, Abel's boss, can't connect with his son. And his son can't connect with his dad. So he runs off to this warehouse and hangs out with a bunch of other kids and by some way finds a connection of family because Shredder and the Foot and everybody there makes him feel like family. That can also lead to this idea of family is not who you grew up with, but the people that you surround yourself with. Granted, this is a toxic place you don't want to make a family in, but in some way they did. They found a family within each other, out of a place where they don't feel like they belong. And I think, like I said previously, this is where the movie tends to really has a great strength and drowns itself more in a dramatic sort of sense than one would think. It has very strong themes of family that I think other films have a hard time trying to distinguish, and that this movie really succeeds at. The last example of showing an identity and theme of family has to be within the Turtles themselves. And this is the greatest strength of not only the movie, but just the characters and how they have seemed to stay within the zeitgeist and pop culture since they came into play, is this sense of family and brothers. Like, as a guy who has 3 other brothers, I totally get it. And I get this kinship and the idea of brothership that these characters have portrayed in different iterations, whether it be the comics, the original comics, the 80s cartoon, the 90s movies, the 2003 series, the 2010 series that Nickelodeon did, or the Michael Bay produced movies, kind of. Well, I mean, it does, but that's another... We'll get there towards the later half. But despite that, all of these interpretations of the Turtles, we get some sense of family and brotherly love within these characters that has stand the test of time since they came into print, essentially. Even if you don't have brothers and you have sisters or cousins or friends that you see as family, you get it. These characters show that sense of brotherly love or family that you can definitely relate to. Leo is the leader, at least somebody who is trying to keep their family together and be the one who has this sense of responsibility to keep everybody together. I strongly relate to. I do that with everybody I'm at. Like, that is, granted, I tell everybody that is what I call my Superman syndrome, is trying to make everything my responsibility and always trying to be there. That's my Superman syndrome, essentially. But that is Leo's character in a nutshell, is this guy who takes up this mantle of the leader and tries to be the glue that holds everybody together. And that is a massively huge task and is super, super hard. Donnie is the brains. Like, hands down, the smart... Well, it's just, yeah, and to some extent would be the smartest. Granted, Leo is more on the tactical side, but Donnie is the brains, especially when it comes to tech. He is the brains. Granted, you don't quite see that in this movie. I don't think you see it much in the 80s animated series too, but in later iterations, like especially the 2003 series, you see that a lot more, of Donnie being this technically savvy character and this very smart turtle. Mikey, the party dude, the life of the party, the guy you would want to hang out with, at least if not a whole day, a short period of time, because he has this sense of fun. He knows how to have fun, you know? And that's somebody that we all would love to hang out with. And then you have Raph. Everybody knows a Raph. Everybody knows a Mikey. Everybody knows a Donnie. Everybody knows a Leo. Raph, I think, in some ways, is also one of the most relatable people because he's the outcast. We all know somebody who's the outcast or have felt the outcast ourselves. And that is Raph. Raphael is the outcast. That is the person that we also relate to as well. Each four of these turtles, these characters, are somebody that we know, somebody that we are. And I think that's what is one of the strengths of these characters that have stand the test of time, is the fact that we have or know somebody that are these characters and we relate to them despite the weirdness of these turtles that know ninjutsu or learn martial arts from a rat and fight ninjas. Like, it's silly, it's ridiculous, but that is what we flock to. That's something that we gravitate and totally relate to these characters for, and I think that is what makes these characters stand the test of time, or at least that we, for some reason, have gravitated towards for the past 35 years, something like that. I think 30 years, maybe. 30, is it 30 years? 30 or 35 years since they've been created. We still seem to have this connection to these characters. So, we've basically grounded down why this movie is well-rounded, but I want to talk about other thoughts, other things that I love about this movie more than just the drama of it. That's great, and that's the comedy. The interactions between brothers it's funny. So to some extent, yeah, it's a bit childish in the way they speak to each other and they act to each other, but it's just utterly funny, innocent and funny, because I've had moments in which I would bust my brother's chops, or they'd bust chops with me, or we'd get in a fight, Granted, that's more on the dramatic moment that I talk about, but brothers mess around. We mess with each other. We know how to have fun with each other. The comedy is great in the interactions together. Like at the very beginning of the movie, when the title card comes up, and we've got the turtles coming up with a catchphrase. It's silly and it's ridiculous.
Awesome! Righteous! Bossa Nova!
Bossa Nova?
Chevy Nova? Excellent!
Moments like that are kind of funny. Just like the moment when Master Splinter's doing his speech about family and needing to know this wisdom that I'm giving you. In the background, you've got Mikey ordering a pizza, which is one of the funniest moments in the movie.
Oh, but no anchovies. And I mean no anchovies. You put anchovies on this thing and you're in big trouble, okay?
I gonna let you know.
That'll do. And the clock's ticking, dude.
Next to later when the pizza delivery guy comes to deliver the pizza, and I cannot count how many times my brother and I have reenacted that scene.
122, 122 and an 8. 122 and an 8. Terrific. Where the heck is 122 and an 8?
You're standing on it, dude. Just slip it down here.
Hey, this is a 10. The tab's 13.
You're 2 minutes late, dude.
Ah, come on. I couldn't find a place.
Wise man say forgiveness is divine, but never pay full price for late pizza.
I gotta get a new route.
Moments like that are genuinely funny, and moments that I have reenacted with my brother or have quoted with my brother. One of my brother's favorite scenes is after Leo and Raph get in a fight. Raph storms off to do, basically, he kind of, I don't know what he does. He like flails around on the roof, tries to practice martial arts. Granted, it's not necessarily martial arts, but you've got Mikey and Donnie in the kitchen, almost like kids. Like Leo and Raph are arguing like a married couple, and then you got Mikey and Donnie in the kitchen, like being the kids, just stuffing their faces. Mikey hands Donnie pork rind. He goes, pork rind. Like, I don't know why. The moments like that are that we quote are ingrained in our head. Granted, part of that's because we've grown up watching this movie so many times, and just the simple fact that it's funny. And as brothers, we get it. We've been there. As brothers, we butt heads or messed around. Like, I've done some pretty stupid stuff with my brothers before, and I think this movie just drills that home on how ridiculously dumb and stupid brothers can be, or siblings can be. And this movie encapsulates that childish sort of essence that siblings tend to have. So when you're dealing with turtles, you have to talk about villains, and there's no greater villain within the Ninja Turtles mythos than Shredder. And Shredder in this movie is great, even though he's just your typical villain of like, oh, I'm evil for evil's sake because I'm evil. Like, that's the kind of villain that we're dealing with in this movie. Don't get me wrong, there's not really much complexity to him except the fact that this rat had scratched his face and now wants vengeance on them. Like, that's his main motivation of it, is just the simple fact that this rat, who was, I think, the brother or love interest to this woman that he loved, killed the rat's master. So in return, the rat scratched his face, and now it's vengeance on this rat and the turtles that he has raised. Like, that's the motivation of this character. But other than that, like, he's got a great entrance. Like, you talk about great movie villain entrances. The two off the top of my head are Darth Vader's entrance and A New Hope. Or actually, I would even say the one in Empire Strikes Back is better. But Darth Vader's entrance and Christoph Waltz's character and Inglourious Bastards is a great. Granted, I hate saying that title, honestly, but that's the name of the movie. But his entrance in that movie is, granted, that intro to that movie is it's peak perfection in terms of story filmmaking and when it comes to creating tension. Those are the two greatest intros in film to me off the top of my head. Are some of the greatest villain entrances in cinema. And granted, this isn't one of the greatest villains in cinema. It's still great. It's a great entrance where you have the doors open and you've got light protruding in this very dark and dark blue tinted room, and you've got this long shadow and this guy with this very feudal Japan looking helmet, this very long cape, claws and everything. It just, the costuming design of Shredder is very interesting, and his entrance, and to me, is a great entrance. Granted, it's not like I almost in some ways relate it to Darth Vader in some ways. Granted, Vader's is done much better. It's a sense of, oh, that's the villain, and the villain looks super cool, even though Shredder's cape looks like a trash bag. His costuming looks cool, and it's just a great entrance because everybody's quiet and they have some sense of fear of the villain. I think Shredder's entrance is great. The voice for Shredder is great. Funny enough, when I was watching it most recently, whenever I heard Shredder's voice, for some strange reason, I was thinking Dr. Claw from the Inspector Gadget cartoon from the 70s and 80s.
Find them. Together we will punish these creatures. These turtles.
Master.
Someday your luck will run out, and I'll be there.
Like, that's for some weird reason what I was getting, but I love it because that voice kind of fits the tone of this movie, and it fits the Shredder that they're using for this interpretation. So Shredder just makes for a really neat and threatening villain, even though he's not that, like, he's menacing for the characters, but you yourself as an audience member don't fear him. You just want the turtles to beat him. But he's just it's one of those villains where it's not that you fear the villain or the villain makes you feel like they're going to win the day over the turtles. Granted, you kind of do towards the end, since he basically beats the crap out of him and Splinter comes in and defeats him. But this movie is, in a sense, where it succeeds on a lot of different aspects you wouldn't expect, and then in the other ways, it meets expectations where you think. Like, it's a movie where, okay, yeah, it's turtles, they're fighting, and it's very goofy fighting, especially like when they're fighting in the antique store. You've got Mikey spinning his nunchucks on his finger, and he just kind of breathes on his fingers and kind of polishes them almost like as if to say, yeah, I'm getting bored, this is too easy. Shredder is just your basic villain, and it's one of those examples of the villain is cool, he looks cool, and that's about it. Like, and he knows how to throw down in some ways, except when Splinter comes in, because Splinter can take him out much more easily. It's so funny. Like, he's really great and cool when it comes to defeating the turtles, and then as soon as Splinter shows up, it's like all of his menacing and brains has like gone out the window. It's like, that rat, and goes to charge at him with the spear. There's no sense of tactical awareness or anything. He just straight up charges at Splinter. Splinter takes the nunchuck and tosses him over the building, where he later falls into a garbage truck and gets smushed. Like that's Shredder's demise in this movie, and it's really it's a really dumb way to go out, because it basically builds up this villain where he is basically cool and everybody fears him and he beats the crud out of everybody, but then like everything goes, all his brains and smartness and his training of being a ninja goes out the window as soon as Splinter comes in. Like it's really stupid. It's what somebody would call like I'm stealing this from Jeremy Johns, but it's basically being Boba Fetted. Granted, you can't say that anymore since Boba Fett is not dead; he's alive now. But it's basically what they did with Boba Fett and Return of the Jedi when he died in the Sarlacc pit. Like he straight up died. Like he's this menacing Mandalorian, and he straight up gets killed. Like that. Like out of building up this character from Empire Strikes Back, he just simply dies like really easily by a blinded Han Solo. That's how Shredder goes out like this. He sees Splinter, charges at him like without thinking anything, just acts on his impulses, and then just instantly dies, which is a very lame way to go out. So I think that's another thing I take away from this movie that I really like, is just the simple fact that Shredder looks cool. He's a really cool looking villain. I like the feudal Japan meets 90s-esque sort of approach. But other than that, like, he's not the most smartest character. I think my favorite Shredder that I've seen, granted, I haven't dived into the 2010 cartoon that Nickelodeon did of TMNT. I haven't quite seen it yet. But I think my favorite interpretation of Shredder has got to be the one from the 2003 series, in which, like, granted, they kind of tweak his story, in which he's an alien in some way, kind of. He is an alien, but he's so cool. Like, his design's so cool. He actually is very menacing. That's honestly got to be my favorite interpretation of Shredder, is that one there. But Shredder's cool in this movie. I'm trying to think of what else I ought to talk about. The weird editing choices in this. Actually, it's not weird editing choices. It's more particularly one scene. It's always weird how they did it, and it's like it kind of throws me out. Like, why did that's weird. Like, I know why they did it. There's a scene in which April is coming out of the manhole, going back home, and she's like, "Well, I don't think you guys would want to come back to my place, so I've got pizza." And Michelangelo, like, in a weird sense of shooting up, it's like they did it in reverse. They shot the, they did the shot in reverse and did it, and fast forward, he like skyrockets in a jagged way out of the manhole cover and goes, "Let's go for it!" It's very weird. And then there's a scene that most people have seen on the internet in which you see the puppetry. Oh my gosh, I have not talked about the puppetry. I'll get to that. But I think it was Leo or Donnie's mouth. Like, he opens to laugh, and you see the actual actor's mouth inside with the turtle's mouth, which is kind of weird and funny. But, like, stuff like that's kind of weird. Some of the humor is a little childish. By childish, like, it's not, like, fart joke childish, but it is just silly and corny and cheesy. But honestly, this movie just has an endearing sense to it that you just kind of, you accept it for what it is, because it does other things well enough that you kind of tend to overlook it. But one last thing I want to touch upon on this movie that I love so much has got to be Jim Henson's puppetry. what he does with the creature shop in this movie it's great. Like, I'm still baffled as to how they do it. If I remember right, you've got the actors in the rubber suits, which must have taken forever to do. And then off camera, I want to say they used the sort of technique, if I had to guess, that Jim Henson used when he did the first Muppet movie. There's a scene, if you haven't seen the Muppet movie, there's a scene in which Kermit the Frog is riding on a bike, and if I remember right, it's controlled remotely off camera. And I want to say that the turtle heads are done in a very similar way. Granted, I could be blowing smoke, but if I had to guess, I want to say that it's done the same way. You've got the actors in the suits, but then you've got the puppeteers offset with like a remote control, maybe doing the mouth movements, which would be my best guess of how they did it. But it just looks cool, and I think that's what really helps sell this movie, is that it's got that Spielberg effect. The Spielberg effect has this way of, like in Jurassic Park or E.T., it has this sense of you can reach out and touch it. And this movie, I think, has that because they use puppetry. It'd be very easy to go a more animated route where they do, like, all the human characters are in live action. Like a Who's Framed Roger Rabbit effect, where you have the humans in live action, and you've got, like, Master Splinter and the turtles in cartoon form. Like, that'd be okay, but I think having these turtles be a puppet, really, I think that really helps the movie a lot more sell the sense of grounded realism, because you can't have, because with the script that they have, the tone that they have, you can't really make this movie work as well as it does if you did them in the Who Framed Roger Rabbit animated / live action sort of format. One of my favorite puppets in this movie has got to be Master Splinter, which honestly is another thing. Master Splinter in this movie has got to be my favorite interpretation of Master Splinter, because he is such this sweet and wise and calming mentor and father figure who really cares and loves his son. I think that's something that the Michael Bay movies kind of miss, and all the other animated renditions of it are okay, but I don't know why. I love the Splinter in this movie because he's just, you want a father who's so loving and caring and wise like this character, and I think that's why I love him so much. He's generally somebody that you would like to call your dad in some way. And granted, it'd be more. Actually, I don't know if dad would be the one I would say. Maybe grandfather I would see, but either way, it's just this really loving and caring character and figure that you really like. And the puppetry done with Master Splinter is done very well. He doesn't walk around very much because it looks kind of... I think it looks... There's one scene where he might... I can't remember. But it would look kind of janky. Oh, yeah, there is. Danny goes to bust him out of the Foot Clan. And granted, he's not exactly walking, but he's being carried by Danny and Casey Jones. But I think if he was to walk, it'd look kind of odd, because I don't know if there's there might be a way. I don't know if there'd be a way where you could have somebody in there and then have somebody animate the head, but I don't think the puppetry would work quite as well if it was done in the same way the turtles were done. I think the puppetry done on Master Splinter is done very well. So I think that's honestly, I think it's all these qualities that I really like about this movie, and I think actually really, really seem to work. Is it corny? Yes. Is it cheesy? Yes. Does a lot of the humor work? Not really. But I think it's the endearing qualities of the characters themselves, at least the longevity of these characters themselves, the very grounded sort of tone that they have, the very strong theme of family, and the relatability that the characters seem to have between each other is great, and I think that's what makes this movie, despite how dated a little bit it is, still seems to entertain today, and is why granted I have, it may be biased, I've watched it many times and have this sort of appreciation for it, but I think it's a lot of these qualities, other qualities too, that I thoroughly enjoy this film quite a bit. Okay, well, I think it's safe to say that this kind of wraps up today's episode. There's not much really else I really have to talk about this film. I mean, it spawned 2 sequels, one which is even more corny and campy than this one. A third one, which is completely boring and not very fun, and the puppeteering is even less so because it's done by a different company. It's not that great of a film. And then, of course, you've got a CGI semi-sequel, and then you've got 2 other live-action movies that were produced by Michael Bay, which were just okay or mediocre at the least. So, yeah, I mean, that's honestly all I have to say. I have a lot of enjoyment in this movie. It's a lot of fun. It's not a cinema masterpiece, but it's just a great, wholesome, fun, funny, corny film from the 90s that I have a lot of nostalgia for and have a lot of fun with. And I hope you guys enjoy the movie if you haven't seen it. If you have seen it, do you enjoy this movie? Do you agree with any of the points I have to say? And I hope you enjoyed this episode. After all, this is episode 1. This may be a little rough. It may change within time, but this is something I think I would really love to do more often, is just discuss film with all of you out there, and hopefully with a guest at some point. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this. Look out for episode 2. I'm going to be doing that very, very soon. I'm very excited for that one. We are going to be covering Paul Verhoeven's 1987 film RoboCop, which is very exciting because that is a movie that I thoroughly love as well. It is very, very, very more complex than this movie, but it's got a really interesting history. There's a lot I want to talk about it, and I hope you guys are very excited for the episode. All right. Hope you guys enjoy. Follow me on YouTube. I'm going to try to do more content soon. And also follow me on Instagram. I don't post on there often, but it should be jwalker531 on Instagram. Follow me there. I'm going to try to do updates on there. And also, I've got a Patreon. So follow me on Patreon if you really want to support this channel and support this podcast, because I have it all structured out. I love to do more content in general, and I want to do more for you guys, and I want to start doing more stuff for myself. So anyway, hope you guys enjoy, and I hope to see you guys very, very soon.